Hi, I'm Jody Lynn Nye, and I'm proud to be a part of a wonderful anthology called Across the Universe, Alternative Beatles Stories, and this is mine. I hope you enjoy it. It's called A New Beginning. Just about dawn, the shimmering bark with one passenger alighted upon the shore. The slender, dark-haired man with eyes like dark brown velvet, clad in a flowing blue-green robe, stepped onto the shingle, and the boat disassembled behind him. Thousands of small silver beetles poured up on the beach, gathering around his sandaled feet, awaiting his will. The swell of music rose around George, the sound of harps, trumpets, choirs of angels, and the frantic screaming of a million female voices as the sun broke through the clouds above him. Embarrassed, he silenced it with a wave of his hand. "I don't need the fanfare, man," he said. "Let's get moving. I can still hear the distress call." A thousand or so of the shining insects carried a simple trunk containing his few possessions up onto the stones beside him. Never one to be burdened down with stuff, he had packed only the necessities when he left the Abbey. Ringo had vacillated for a long while about leaving, but it was George who had finally decided he had had enough. Someone had to break the tension that had been building up between the four wizards of the Tetrad. Nature itself depended upon it. Together, the four of them had made the world a more peaceful place, but the building resentment between them, and yes, petty little power plays, threatened to destabilize the beautiful thing that they had built. In their battle to decide which of them had given the most to the partnership, they'd totally forgotten their mission to spread love across the world. One morning, he didn't say a word, just collected his things, slung his guitar over his shoulder, and walked out the big, echoing double doors. They closed behind him with a bang that sounded like 1,000 strings snapping. The tetrad was shattered. He was leaving the Apple and Appalachia, maybe for good. The years of their union had been the most wonderful George had ever experienced. With the 12 strings of his guitar and his light, gentle voice, he controlled the element of water. As a boy, he had been quietly making music by himself, ensuring enough but not too much rain fed the fields of his small community, experimenting with all the forms of his art. When the fire and air duo of John and Paul descended upon him like the lightning they were. They told him he had the potential to be the greatest water mage of all time, and they wanted him to be part of their group. Drawing him into their partnership gave him a sense of brotherhood he had never had before. He didn't recall when Ringo had joined them. He had always just seemed to have been there, earth-solid and earth-wise, a comfort to the rest of them when the world didn't get what they were doing. Together, they made the best songs and purest harmonies, which produced the strongest magic ever known to the land. It stopped crime, improved the weather, cured acne, arthritis, and teenage anxiety, even made school cafeteria food taste good. They made it possible for the people of Appalachia to live in peace. Each of the tetrad has his contradictions. For all his insistence that peace was the greatest goal that anyone could have, John was the least peaceful person imaginable. Fire suited him. He had a tendency to lash out and destroy what angered him. With the magnified power of the Tetrad's combined talents, that meant he could burn down a castle or send comets hurtling across the sky. Paul was the breath of music itself. His talent and John's fed one another until the very wonder of their imaginings made everything feel better. No one could get enough of him, but Paul never felt confident about that love. Despite his talent with Earth, Ringo could lighten things up better than the rest of them. He was just good to be around. George had his own contradictions. Despite the tendency of water to go with the flow, he bucked against assumptions and trends, as now. The world still needed them and they needed each other, but the feud had grown so toxic that George had to get away from it. John and Paul usually started it, throwing air and fire around until the whole place stank of ozone. They'd drag him into it to mediate, and that worked until one or the other of them made an offhand remark that denigrated his contribution to the group as being less than their own. What if his fingers were often more eloquent than his speech? His music carried on with the magic when their voices didn't. How was that less? He took the abuse as long as he could, then doused both of them with water. Ringo would come in and try to make peace. One of the others would tell him to butt out, and before you knew it, there would be hot, soupy mud flying all over the Abbey in the midst of a loud cacophony. Not that George had ever heard a quiet one. What made him stay and even clean up in the aftermath was that no matter how bitter the arguments got, one of them would suddenly start laughing. Then the four of them, the most powerful magical synergy in the world, sat on the floor clutching their instruments, spattered with mud, howling and pointing at one another, and no one could even recall why they were arguing in the first place. Until one day came when no one laughed. Air and Fire thought that they could still work together, even though they were destroying one another. They needed a break. Earth was content to be with any of them as long as they were still making magic and music. Their focus was all inward, but water flows outward. George had to leave and let them get on with it. He already missed the rest of the tetrad, and he knew they loved and missed him, but giving them space was for their own good. If life was long enough, they'd come together again, he hoped. They were four parts of a magical whole, but without peace, they didn't have a chance. In the meantime, the world still desperately needed their magic. He could feel eddies of fear coming from outside, and no doubt the others could too, and he felt it was his sacred duty to do something about it. He left the Abbey and went out on the road. Once he left, the tension started to drop immediately, and he picked up on specific points of need coming from other wizards he knew across the world. His fellow wizards were always sending messages to one another by means of carrier pigeons, patterns in clouds, miraculous shapes burned into breakfast toast, weird-shaped potato crisps, and so on. The most pressing came from Lone Star, where sweet-voiced Roy held sway as chief magician. Like Paul, Roy commanded the element of air, so he sent bubble packs through the currents that George could read. It wasn't like him to panic over nothing, so whatever was going wrong had to be big. George sent him a message that he was on his way and forwarded the bubble mail to all the other music mages he knew outside. The Silver Beatles had formed into both rudder and propeller on the boat, made up of thousands of their number, but George had had to sing up the currents a number of times to make any speed. Paul could have called the winds, but Paul was back there in Appalachia. George had to get his own mojo back, finding that same love within, let himself feel it as well as giving it to others who needed it. He opened himself up to the music and all flowing water, rain, streams, oceans, even the trickle that ran down hillsides from creative wells. On the journey, new creativity hit George so strongly that a whole album's worth of new songs came to him on the several days' trip. The presence of endless quantities of really potent seaweed helped to open his mind too. Before he knew it, he felt like his old self. Music and magic poured into him and out again, just like in the cycle of the universe. Behind him, the young wizard sensed his three friends behind him experiencing their own renewed clarity. It had been years since their minds hadn't been tied together as one. He felt ready for anything. George turned his back on the shore and started walking. The mighty river that poured down the slope toward the sea beckoned to him, offering to carry him upstream wherever he wanted to go. "Thanks," he said. He slung the guitar around to the front so he could reach the strings and struck a chord. "It's time I carried me own weight for a while." It didn't take a genius to realize something massively bad was happening in Lone Star. On the first road George came to, he found he was the only one traveling toward the capital. People rushed past him in or on carts, flying carpets, horseback, unicorn-back, bicycles, tricycles, quadricycles, and pogo sticks. Three-headed snakes, four-door dragons, pumpkin coaches howled by giant white mice, even a few flapping pedal-powered aircraft, but especially on foot, running away. "What's back there?" he asked one person after another, but no one could give him a coherent answer. Gambling, they pointed over their shoulders with terror and disgust on their faces. Everyone acted so freaked out, he began to play soothing melodies on his guitar. The music emerged from the soundboard as a snowstorm of little pink hearts and delicate blue and gold clouds. The fleeing crowds held up their arms to shield their faces from the floating particles, but as soon as the clouds and hearts touched them, they lowered their arms again. Every face grew a smile, and their frantically churning, hopping, or pedaling feet slowed down to a normal pace. No one turned back, though. "If you're smart," a young woman said as she passed him on her white-striped camel, "you'd leave too. It's too risky." "Can't help it," he said. "I'm a born risk-taker." She shook her head. George tuned the A string on his guitar back to 440 and readied a defensive spell or two, but he kept walking. From a distance, Lone Star looked like a nice place, not a million miles from the green meadows, rolling hills, and neat little villages where he had grown up. Nothing attacked him or even seemed out of place. The river continued to follow him on his right. He dipped a finger into it to see if Roy had left him any more messages, but sensed nothing except the ongoing alarm that had attracted his attention in the first place. He hoped his friend was all right. Nobody leaving Lone Star seemed to be injured or anything but frightened. Then the stink hit him. Wave upon wave of oily, noisome, putrid putrefaction, putrefying the air, the land, and the water. Did he mention putridity? Hit him like the folds of a horrible, wet, clingy curtain. George gasped. It had been years since he had smelled that particular noxious odor, but George couldn't have forgotten it if his nose had been cut off. Pilchards. Oh, no, not him. His knees gave with the shock. He started to sink to the ground, but the silver beetles caught him and formed a chair underneath him. Another contingent caught the guitar and cradled it gently. George stared at the city ahead of him in disbelief. Pilchards! The pilcherer couldn't be here! No wonder Roy was desperate for help. Few of their number could withstand the insidious evil creature. Certainly he hadn't been able to. The one time that the Tetrad had fought the pilcherer, they had lost, and it took them years to rebuild what the monster had destroyed. It had started so subtly. A smell of fish here and there in the Abbey, nothing more alarming than the odor of breakfast kippers. They razzed Paul about stray air currents. He was capable of a good practical joke as the rest of them, but he pleaded innocence. Then the floor and walls began to feel slippery, which had to be George's fault, but wasn't. Then things that they were certain they had placed in one spot or another went missing. Strange people began to turn up at their outdoor rituals and performances, watching and taking notes. That seemed nothing new. The Tetrad were used to the press, but it all had an off-key feel about it. Then they realized that the Abbey itself had been infiltrated. The overwhelming smell was everywhere. George couldn't think or play in its midst. Then, one horrible day, their stronghold was overrun. Fish of every kind, of kinds no one even thought existed until that moment, started to appear. They swam in through the bathroom window, down the chimney, up to the drains, through any open door. The Tetrad did everything that they could to drive them out, but the fish deflected the spells. George couldn't control them because they weren't swimming in water. They defied gravity, breaking all laws of physics. But by whose authority? John threw bolt after bolt of lightning until there was enough fried fish to feed everyone in Appalachia, but they kept coming. The plague of fish spread to every part of the island. There were plice in every place, tuna confiscating everyone's tuning forks, haddock giving them headaches, tenches in the trenches, sharks in the park, and cod help them, goldfish pouring out of every downspout, but mainly pilchards. Thousands of pilchards, millions of pilchards, little bony monstrosities, getting into the works, shedding oil, tomato sauce, or melted butter and lemon everywhere. People begged the Tetrad to stop the menace, but apart from a general issue of grease-proof bibs and malt vinegar, there was little they could do. In the midst of this all marched the pilcherer, a big blowhard of a hairy-cheeked troll towering over everyone's head, wielding an accordion the size of a bus and almost as tuneful. His horrible, gnarly fingers ran up and down the keys in what he claimed were the scales of justice. They were so bad and so loud that he utterly overwhelmed the Tetrad's music and all their efforts to stop him. He stripped them of their powers and took the protesting wizards prisoner. The insult of it all was that he wasn't even a magician or a proper lawman. He only had a fake book that he had stolen from an ancient enchantress whom he had convinced he knew best. Worse yet, he made it look like the Tetrad's fault that he had invaded Appalachia. He persuaded the public that the Tetrad were too weak to defend them and claimed to be their official ruler. Appalachia fell under the most onerous authority. No one could just sit around and jam, or they'd get a load of fish dumped on them. The whole thing stank of corruption and sardines. Locked up in their soundproof prison, the four of them were numbed by the invasion. It took a while, but the Tetrad managed to pull themselves together and get back on their feet. Together with their remaining faithful fans, they mustered every note that they had ever written and managed to drive the pilcherer and his keyboard menace out of the Abbey and the land, but the effort consumed everything they had, including their reputations. It turned out that the pilcherer had also made life miserable for Mick, Keith, Ronnie, and the other wizards in other lands. When they cleaned up, they discovered all sorts of stuff had gone missing, but the worst thing was the theft of their self-confidence. Some Appalachians never stopped being convinced that the Tetrad had done something wrong to bring the pilcherer down on them. People no longer believed that their magic worked. It was a blow to the Four's confidence. George had lost his first muse, Patty, over the controversy. The Tetrad all but stopped performing their wonders in public and gone back to making music in their inner sanctum. George envied Elvis, who had given up the crowns but never lost his fan base's faith. Ringo thought it was a good thing that they became more vigilant. The tetrad had slid into complacency, thinking nothing could ever change their secure little world. The invasion had given them a kick up the backside, reminded them what they were there to do. And that's where the trouble began. Without feedback from the crowds, they started to undermine one another. The pilcherer was to blame for the crisis, but the aftermath had to be laid at their own feet. Even after the monster had gone away, he left them mired in their own muck. The tetrad had vowed revenge, but the fact was the group was wary of trying. Now it looked as though George had no choice but to go up against the pilcherer again. Roy was counting on him. He stood up, leaving the silver chair to dissolve itself behind him, hitched the guitar tighter on its strap across his shoulder, and marched into the abandoned city. Over and over again, he played the catchy opening bars of a song he and Roy had played together, hoping to hear his friend join in. The questing music echoed off storefronts and rang in empty squares. Statues aimed empty gray eyes toward him. Not a living thing roamed the streets but him and his horde of beetles. He hoped he was wrong about the pilcherer, but Lone Star smelled like a long-abandoned fish market after months of unseasonably warm temperatures. If he hadn't already gone veggie, George would have vowed never to eat sushi again. It felt strange being so alone. Not that he was in a hurry to face the pilcherer, but the sensation of crisis only grew, making his stomach roil like a maelstrom. Then, in the middle of the cobblestone street, he spotted a red line leading off around the next corner. It seemed churlish not to follow it, so he did. The moment he set foot on it, eerie music started to play from somewhere. The blue sky vanished behind iron-gray clouds. George gulped. Talk about your dramatic tension. The new street was lined with identical terraced houses stretching off into the distance, identical net curtains framing one wilted potted plant in each identical window. The longer he trudged, the more uneasy he felt. The whole town had the air of the set of a bad movie, complete with sinister soundtrack and lowering clouds. Wouldn't it be just about time for something properly fictional to happen? As if in answer to his thoughts, he came to the end of the line, and the street tipped up underneath him. A vast, dark, steaming chasm opened up. George, guitar, trunk, silver beetles and all tumbled into the groove. "Help!" he shouted. He captured just enough moisture in the air to cushion his fall, instead of crashing to the rocky floor of the undercity. He sprang up in time to catch his guitar and shield it from the rain of beetles. Above them, the pavement snapped shut, cutting off the sunlight with a thunderous boom. It took a minute for his eyes to get used to the murk. Faint yellow light came from irregular smears of moss or fungus on the walls and the floor of the chamber. He couldn't see far, but he got the impression of a vast room, almost as large as the Albert Hall. "So he got you too," a warmly melodious voice called. George spun and peered into the shadows. "Roy? Where are you, man?" He heard a raspy voice. "This way, George. How many roads did you have to walk down to get here?" "Just the one," George said. "Bob, too. Who else is there?" "Me and Jeff." It was Tom. George's heart sank. All the friends he had informed about Roy's distress call were stuck down here. They'd fallen, literally, into a trap. He felt his way across the room. "There you are," Roy said, his voice very close now. George's hands closed on iron bars damp from condensation. Through them, he glimpsed the familiar figure clad in black, with circles of black glass covering his eyes and his stark white face. "We've tried everything to sing the lock open, but it's tone deaf. Our guitar's locked in a box over there." He pointed through the bars at a chest near the mold-covered wall. "Who did this to you?" George asked. "I don't know, big hairy guy," Bob said. "He seemed all pissed off when we didn't know who he was." "Did he call himself the pilcherer?" "Yeah," Tom exclaimed. "That's the name." "Same guy who harassed you?" "That's the one," George said. "But it's all right now," Jeff said cheerfully. "The tetrad is here. You'll get rid of him just like you did in Appalachia." George felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but he couldn't escape from reality. "No, it's just me." "Just you?" Roy echoed. "I thought when you sent the message you were on your way, that meant all of you." No. "Where are the others?" "We kind of broke up." "Bummer." "Hey, I'm sorry, man," Roy said gently, "but one of you's better than none. Right, guys?" "Weird way to start a solo career," Tom added with a shrug, "but hey." "Right," Jeff said. The false brightness in his tone embarrassed George even more. "I know you can do it. Do you think you can get us out of this cage?" For a moment, George thought about trying to reach out to the rest of the tetrad and asking for their help. He shook his head. He couldn't, mustn't, shouldn't do that. They were dealing with their own stuff. He had to figure out a way to do it himself. "It'll be no problem," he said. projected confidence he didn't really feel. "Where's the lock?" "We tried everything we've got on it," Roy said, as George examined the huge square iron keyhole under the glow of Bob's fire magic. "It doesn't seem to obey any of the laws of nature or supernature." George felt the surface. It certainly had the Pilcherer's signature, slime and all. He wiped his fingertips dry on the front of his robe. "The good news is this is the same kind of lock he used on us back in Appalachia," George said, standing back. "Great," said Bob. "That sounds like there's bad news," Jeff said, with a grimace on his long face. "How bad?" "Bad, man. Very bad. If I open it without using the key, it'll blow up. The one on our cell door took out a quarter of the Abbey." George shrugged. "On the good side, it was the part we always meant to renovate." "Key," Roy said at once. "Definitely get the key." "That means finding the Pilcherer," George said. The ceiling suddenly peeled back, letting in a blaze of light that momentarily blinded him, and a wave of stench blew through the room. "Or he could find us." Automatically, the silver beetles packed themselves around him, forming a suit of armor that left only his face and hands uncovered. "Who are you, little man?" boomed a discordant voice that George hoped he would never hear again. George stood straight, pulled his guitar around to his front, and placed his hands on the strings. Very slowly, he turned to face the intruder. He was overcome by a nearly inescapable urge to run, to throw up, to start shrieking, but he wouldn't give the Pilcherer the satisfaction of making him cower again. "Right," he said, eyeing the troll up and down. 20 feet tall, gnarly hands, a greasy thatch of hair that looks like you were dragged through a hedge backward at least 7 times, a face that only a mother could love, if she was blind, a lumpy nose like a rotten potato, and oh yeah, a goggly mouth like a fish. Or should I say a pilchard? The giant blinked, and a wide smile spread across his horrible face. "Little man, you sound familiar." George ordered the Beatles to retreat, leaving him in his long robe. He held himself straight, guitar in hand, and shook out his long hair. "You know my name." The smile widened still further. "And I've got your number, haven't I, little man? You're like these." The Pilcherer reached down and lifted the cage. With a malevolent look on his hairy face, he shook it. The wizards inside bellowed. "Don't they sing pretty? You made the same noise as when I bunged you up." Yeah, George said with a dismissive wave. "You gave us a nice vacation, that's for sure. How did you find Appalachia? Pleasant? You didn't even say goodbye when you left. We quite missed you." "Not really, I'm just being polite." The Pilcherer's face turned brick red. "Where are your other little friends?" "I don't need them to deal with a poor fish like you," George said, keeping it casual, while he summoned up the local water magic. He was going to need every milliliter, every note. The power felt very timid, as though the presence of the Pilcherer terrified it. He completely understood. He sent out persuasive vibrations full of love and support. "One monster, one wizard, sounds like a fair deal to me." The Pilcherer sent the cage full of musicians flying over the nearest building. George heard the distant crash and winced. "Your friends felt the same, and I'll enjoy humiliating them some more once I deal with you." The monster hauled up his massive accordion and squeezed a discordant blast of stink out of it. His ears ringing in protest, George dealt the cloud a chord that drove it back. "That's B, for be gone," he said, "and B-O. Have you tried a stronger deodorant? I wouldn't mention it otherwise, but I think you've driven the population away with your stench." The Pilcherer sniffed, broad, evil grin. "Nice try, little man. You are alone, and not what you once were. Did they throw you out? You were the weak link in the chain." George held his head high. "You're right. I'm not what I once was. I'm better than I was, and we had no weak links." For that insult, he was going to send the Pilcherer into next week. George launched into one of the Tetrad's most powerful songs. He started to chant the incantation, but remembered too late that it wasn't one in which he normally had a vocal part. His voice trailed off into silence, and the fierce energy that he had been building died away. Too late, he started to play the lead guitar part. The Pilcherer laughed. "Is that all you brought, little man?" The troll ran his fingers up and down the buttons on his massive accordion and blazed out an arpeggio. The odor the notes produced propelled George backward a dozen yards. He scrambled up. What was wrong? That was one of their most powerful spells. But he'd never performed it alone. He still wasn't thinking like a solo artist. The Pilcherer's terrible music bounced him this way and that while he tried to come up with an alternative. But they were mostly water-based, and the Pilcherer was immune to his water magic. The overwhelming stink swamped his senses, but his ears suffered the most. He needed the other's strength, but they were an ocean away. The monster assaulted him with another bray from his instrument. George felt the strings on his guitar quivered with tension. "Don't break now," he begged them. He couldn't let the pilcherer lock him up again. What would the others do? John would goad him, that was what. "Hey, big man," George said with a fleering expression on his face. "Where are your usual backup singers? The ones who really practice their scales, your fish." The pilcherer laughed. "You mean these?" Suddenly, the bright sky darkened as tons and tons of fish plummeted from the sky. George found himself buried to the neck in herring, cod, trout, and slimy, writhing eels. He couldn't move a finger for all the fish. The pilcherer slung his accordion aside and reached for George with one massive hand. The water mage squirmed between a school of bass and a horde of rockfish, trying to stay out of reach. He threw all the power he had been building up at the massive fish, willing them to rise up and fling themselves at their master. They didn't shift. He shook his head to clear it. He should have known better. He couldn't control the pilcherer's fish. All that was under his command was his own element, water. And a massive river lay less than a block away, and had been at his side all the way from the shore. Instead of dealing with the fish directly, he could change their environment. He called to the river. It was happy to send millions of gallons of water his way. In no time, the street flooded to a depth of 1 fathom, 2, 3, 4. The fish swam away, freeing his arms to play his guitar. He wasn't afraid of being completely submerged. Water couldn't harm him. To his delight, the fish seemed happier. They swam in joyful circles around him, nudging him in thanks. The cruel pilcherer must have been starving them of their normal environment. George ordered the mass of water to flow back toward the river. It obliged, taking all the swimming creatures with it. The pilcherer stomped his feet. "Come back," the troll bellowed. "I order you." If fish could laugh, every school in the swirling tsunami would have hooted and cheered. George steered the wave back to the nearly empty riverbed. He struck a mighty C octave, and the water sloshed down, swamping both banks from sea to shining sea. "Come back," the pilcherer demanded, jumping up and down in his fury. "They won't, you know," George said. "They didn't want to overstay their welcome. You know what they say about fish and visitors. 3 days max." "I'll give you 3 days," the troll snarled. "No thanks," George said, enjoying himself for the first time. "You're the last person I want to spend that much time with." The pilcherer grabbed for his accordion and peeled off a nasty version of Lady of Spain. Wincing at the stench, George deflected it with his own version and turned it into a jazz riff on Bad Penny Blues. The pilcherer wasn't expecting to have his weapon turned against him. He let out a raucous shriek and dragged his fingers up and down the vertical keyboard. The noise made the ground shake beneath their feet. "You know why your music stinks," George said. "You can't carry a song in an armored car. You can tune a guitar. You can tune a piano. But you can't tune a fish." His taunts made the pilcherer play even worse, something George didn't even think was possible. "What's the matter, big fella? No one ever turned your music back on you before? You've never really had a battle of the bands." "Come on then, little man," the pilcherer boomed, squeezing both sides of his terrible instrument together. The stink wave caused all the buildings on George's side of the street to collapse. "Do what you can." George countered and reprised everything the pilcherer threw at him, but was making no ground. The pilcherer kept a devastating threnody running on the keyboard of his instrument, then, with a horrible grin, pressed 5 buttons at the same time. The shrieking of millions of female voices rose higher and higher, sending George to his knees with his hands over his ears. The guitar fell slack around his neck. George wanted to curl up like a snail and moan. "Pull yourself together, man," a voice boomed. George looked up. The voice had come from inside his head. The silver beetles massed before him on the broken pavement, roiling together like bubbles in boiling liquid. They rose up in columns, and the columns took shape. With a laugh, George recognized them as avatars of his own friends. Each of the tetrad had identities they took when they wanted to be somebody else. Towering above him as bright were Billy Shears, Denny Sobel, and Goo Goo Gajoob, huge and powerful, weird and wonderful. The sight of them gave George comfort. No matter how far away they were, their love and magic were with him. "You've got this, man," Billy Shears said, and George felt the power of earth added to his own water magic. "You always do it right," Dennis Sobel added, with finger guns to back it up. Air swirled around George's head. Goo Goo Gajoob's eyes flashed fire, as they always did, and the massive whiskered cheeks twitched upward in a smile around the gap between his oversized teeth. "Don't let this imbecile win. He's a drag on the universe. Do what he did to us. Throw him off guard. Think big. Think bigger." George nodded. Self-doubt had been the most powerful weapon that the pilcherer could have wielded against him and the tetrad. It had worked then because they weren't aware of its insidious nature, but he was now. It would not work if he didn't let it. For the first time, he assessed the pilcherer's weaknesses. None of the troll's spells were original. He worked strictly from other people's catalogs without understanding the music or the meaning of the words. More annoying yet, he couldn't stay on key, so he was constantly dropping power when he made a mistake. George's chord progressions were always perfect, so he built from strength to strength. George countered every one of his foe's musical phrases with one better. His fingers strummed out more and more complicated melodies. The pilcherer couldn't follow a single one of them and began to weaken. George laughed. "This is not a game, little man," the troll bellowed. "Life's a game, Grumpy. You can enjoy it or let it destroy you." He mustered all the talent he had. Shifting keys up a half step at a time, his music rang out. The spirit of water built within him. The sleeves of his robe widened out at the wrists until they formed amplifiers that blasted his music at the pilcherer. Big, John had told him. Bigger! The power gushed out of him in a massive and satisfying flow, more powerful than a waterfall or all the tides of the sea. He called for water, wherever it was in Lone Star. Waves washed up to him from the river, underground wells, streams, even clouds above them, until he had an ocean around him ringing with his song. He formed a massive guitar, all made of water, and began to play the songs he had composed on his way across the ocean. Every chord resonated up to the sky. It washed the pilcherer backward until the troll fell into a huge metal tank unearthed by the destruction. George saw his opportunity and sang it shut. "No!" the pilcherer yelled, banging on the inside of the can. The rotten accordion got its own tin. "Let me out of here!" "Sorry," George said, summoning a key to lock it tight. "See how you like being shut up for a while. Now I've got to clean up your mess." He took a deep breath and let the waters recede. He felt vindicated, strong, and grateful. He turned back to the shining avatars. "Thanks, fellas," he said. "You did it all yourself, George," Ringo said with a smile. "You didn't really need any help from your friends. See you around." The silver figures collapsed and the Beatles swarmed around George's feet, clamoring for approval. George gave it to them. He felt wonderful. The rest of the tetrad was still there for him, but he could manage on his own. If he went back to the Abbey, the group would be stronger than ever, but for a while he wanted to see how strong he could be by himself. He let the water guitar flow away and used his faithful 12-string to begin cleaning up the street, drying the pavement, repotting flowers, even sending gentle breezes to drive away the last stink of fish. He sent out melodies with messages of love resounding outward across Lone Star and out into the rest of the world. Sooner or later the people would come back. Lone Star would be just as good as it was before. No, better. Yeah, like him. Roy and the other three wizards came running around the corner. George was glad to see that they had escaped the pilcherer's cage. Their clothes were torn, and Bob had a huge burn mark on the back of his robe. He beamed with relief. "Hey, George!" Roy shouted. They rushed over to shake his hand and pound him on the back. "You fellows all right?" he asked. "We crashed hard, but we're all right," Tom said. His long blonde hair was soaked. "The bar split on impact." "Where's the pilcherer?" "In there," George said, pointing back toward the rocking and swearing tin. He handed the key to Roy. "Over to you." The black and white mage grinned. "Nice job, man. You were right. One monster, one wizard." He peered over his dark glasses. "But it has to be the right wizard." "Thank you." "It was no trouble," George said modestly. Roy summoned up a whirlwind. The yelling tin whisked away. "Where'd he go?" George asked. The pale magician grinned. "Away. We won't see him again any time soon, and we'll spread the word. He won't be able to pull this on musicians anywhere else after this." "You played some pretty good music there, George," Tom said. They retrieved their own guitars and knapsacks from the box in the underground room and began to tune up. "We could hear you all the way across town. How'd that last one go? I want to try it." In the middle of the ruined town, George sat down and played the phrases until the others picked them up and started to jam. They added their own touches to the melody, built in harmonies and counterpoints. The Silver Beatles provided percussion, since all 5 magicians were guitarists. The 5 of them sounded pretty darn good together. George felt as if he was back in the Abbey, with talented people who got where he was coming from, and he liked it. "Man, I'm pooped," Jeff said, throwing himself down. "That sounded great, guys." "It was magical," Bob said, "just what we needed after that ordeal." "The pilcherer was a real monster," Roy said. "I'm grateful all of you came to help. But it was George who saved us all. We owe you, buddy. What can we do for you?" "Got something to eat? A fella can get hungry traveling." Will berries be enough? Tom asked, rummaging through his backpack and coming up with a battered paper bag. Just about everything else still stinks of fish. It'll do for a start, George said, running his finger up and down his guitar strings. Playing with the wizards here wasn't like the Tetrad, but nothing ever would be. It was good to know he could belong and be himself in other places than just the Abbey. Mind if I stick around for a while? I hope you enjoyed my story, and you can get your own copy of Across the Universe. Please scan the QR code or check out Amazon. It's available in both e-form and paperback. And I hope that you're all safe and well in your isolation, and hope you enjoy.